Friends, very good to see you. Thank you for joining us once again. James, good to see you too.
Yes, excellent to see you too, Ian. Yeah.
And you resisted telling me a joke before we started, which was very helpful.
Well, almost, yes.
Almost.
Yes.
Okay.
Right, well, maybe we should begin the video with a joke instead of a number, who knows?
Go on, give us your joke then.
Well, my joke of the minute is I've been successful in persuading people to throw away their smartwatches and go back to analog watches.
And that makes you?
It's me. I'm a TikTok influencer.
Very good. Very good. Very apposite, actually. Very timely.
Very timely, yeah.
Friends, don't worry about the bad jokes from James. Don't let that put you off.
No.
Because we are on video number 133.
Yes. Which is a not very interesting number.
It's not prime. I thought it was because 131
is prime. No, but it is semi-prime.
Okay.
Because it's the product of two prime numbers.
Right.
Which is 7 and 19.
Yeah, and 19 is not particularly interesting either.
No. 7, of course, is very interesting.
It is. That's true.
In all sorts of ways, but not 19. Okay. So there we are.
Well, we probably ought to get on to then where we are in the lectionary and what our Bible passage is for today.
Much better.
Yeah.
So this is it's sort of pivotal moment in the lectionary. It's the Feast of the Presentation of Christ in the Temple.
Yeah.
So the story of Simeon and Anna is the gospel reading, and we'll link to that video, I'm sure.
Yes, there's a link underneath because we did that 3 years ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Which was our second video, I think it might have been.
It probably was, actually. Yeah. So, yes, apologies for any quality issues.
Yep.
And the New Testament reading on this Sunday is Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 to 18.
Now, this is interesting, isn't it? A bit of a challenge.
A bit of a challenge, yeah. I mean, I think Hebrews is, particularly in the earlier chapters, is always a challenge, isn't it? I mean, there's some purple passages in Hebrews which everybody knows, but there's other bits which are not.
There are, and it is interesting. It just occurs to me as you mentioned that. I was going to say exactly the same thing. I think people treat Hebrews in preaching a bit like they treat the book of Revelation, which is that you pick out your favourite little passages, preach on those, and never preach on anything else.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking, I can't remember if I've ever preached on Hebrews. Have you?
Yeah, I have preached on Hebrews. I definitely preached on Hebrews 12, but it is inevitably, and 13, but it is inevitably the purple passages, yeah.
Yes. And one of the things I absolutely love is just the opening verse, which is that in many and various ways God spoke to us in the past, but in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son. Now, that's not irrelevant, actually, because one of the things we're going to find out is that there is some oddities about Hebrews, and I think, again, a reason why people shy away from it a bit. One of those is that a lot of the ideas are implicit rather than explicit. And one of the things we'll see is that the whole notion of Jewish understandings of eschatology of the last days are implicit here, but very rarely.
Very much so. In fact, I have preached on Hebrews 1 several times at Christmas at midnight services, which is one of the set readings for Christmas. Yeah. And it is a marvellous piece, just those first sort of 4 verses or so, because they do completely nail the Incarnation, what Jesus is about, which actually, of course, is the theme which informs chapter 1 and chapter 2 and onwards. So there's, as you say, there's very much a link to our passage in front of us today.
There is. Before we plunge into the passage, we ought to just notice some of the things that are distinctive, unusual, challenging about Hebrews as a text, shouldn't we?
Yeah, we should, because I mean, it's kind of unique in the epistles in the New Testament, really, isn't it? I mean, it's not Pauline. It's not
what the Authorized Version says.
Yeah, despite you'll find in the King James Version, it still says the letter of Paul to the Hebrews.
Now, by the way, one of the interesting factors about which I learned from Michael Parsons, we mentioned Michael Parsons in his Padilla commentary on Luke. Michael wrote a fascinating article about numerical composition in the New Testament, including in the canon. And one of the reasons why it was important in the early church to believe that Paul wrote Hebrews is that how many churches did Paul write to, by the way, in the letters in the New Testament?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
7, right? And if you include Hebrews, how many letters of Paul do we have altogether in the New Testament? 14.
Yeah.
And Michael Parsons just points out that numerical shape for the canon of the New Testament text was actually quite important. So there we are. But actually, we don't think that it was written.
No, it doesn't claim to be written by Paul. And
exactly.
And the language is very, very, very different from any of the.
And I think actually both of us noticed that. One of the things I noticed particularly, this is an interesting feature of language, is one of the things that's difficult about language to get right is prepositions and conjunctions. And actually, you can always tell if someone's not a native speaker of their language, because the one thing that's easy to stumble on is the way that the prepositions are used.
It is, and I think when people analyze writers, the one of the distinctives is to analyze the use of prepositions, and it's been used to assert Pauline authorship of.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just noticed reading through that. I mean, for example, in verse 17, therefore is othen. I don't think. Sorry, hothen. I don't think I've actually come across that word in Paul. I mean, I haven't done a study of it.
No,
it just struck me thinking that's unusual. It's usually much more. You have un, which you do have in verse 14.
And
all the way through, just these little connectives and prepositions and logical connectives and things. They're just all very different, very different. But I mean, the language is quite distinct, isn't it? There's an awful lot of distinctive vocabulary.
Yeah, and I mean, some people would say it's the best Greek of the New Testament. It's certainly a literary style of Greek, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which is interesting.
It has a lot of those things that we loved finding out about when we first studied theology, which is hapax legomena.
It does, indeed, where this is the only use of the word in the New Testament. Yeah.
Hapax legomena is just the Greek for hapax meaning once, legomena spoken.
Spoken, yeah.
So one thing that only comes once. But it's always great fun when people discover the word hapax legomenon.
It is. There's something rather wonderful about that phrase, isn't there?
Yeah. But there's some interesting, curious things theologically about this text as well.
There are. There are. I mean, it's very much focused, isn't it, on the high priesthood of Jesus,
which is not mentioned anywhere else outside Hebrews in the New Testament. Amazingly,
no,
because it is such a significant theological idea.
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think you were saying earlier, it doesn't mention resurrection.
Well, it doesn't mention Jesus' resurrection.
No, it doesn't. No. Which is astonishing.
Yes. And I suppose the reason why we need to make sure we read each of the individual texts in the context of the whole.
Yeah, we have to read canonically, don't we? Yeah, as we would say. Yeah.
Although I would again say, we'll touch on this. I think that the resurrection is implicit here. But we should put those two things together, actually. Jesus as high priest on the one hand and not mentioning the resurrection on the other, because it seems to me that the theological register of what Jesus has achieved, instead of talking about his resurrection, it talks about the fact that he is now alive and interceding for us.
Yeah.
That can only be the case if
he's been raised,
conquered death, and he has been raised, and he is now alive.
Yeah. And of course, the passage in front of us today talks about him destroying death. So
exactly. Yeah. So good.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that's interesting in terms of where our passage comes in is that we've had in chapter 1 a great deal about Jesus' otherness. He is higher than us. He's, so on.
Yeah.
And now the writer kind of
and that's expressed in this sort of catena of quotations from the Old Testament. This is something else distinctive about Hebrews, which is it is constantly quoting from the Old Testament, but also consistently from the Septuagint, that is the Greek Old Testament.
Yeah, and particularly keen on the Psalms. And
absolutely. Yeah. And then you got this whole string of quotations from 1:5 through to 1:15. But just still going about Hebrews, connecting. It's written to the Hebrews that's concerned with Jewish ideas, but written with Greek philosophical language as well, which is really unusual.
Yeah, and which rather implies that we're dealing with Hebrews, Jewish people in the diaspora, who are profoundly influenced and affected by Greek culture.
Ideas. Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you. You were talking about Jesus' exaltation.
So I was just thinking, about there's a sort of paradox in the first couple of chapters where we've got Jesus is wholly other. He's beyond. He's beyond the angels, as it were.
Yeah.
And yet, he's also the one who identifies with us.
Yes.
And this is what's particularly to the fore in our passage. But it's holding those two things together, which, of course, is one of the things that I think Christians find quite difficult in many ways.
Yeah.
And the church historically has found difficult. I mean, many of the arguments in the early church were over what is the nature of what is Jesus' nature. And some of those are kind of addressed in here, even before they became huge areas of discourse. So
that's one thing I found striking. I mean, I know you've been looking at different commentaries. I've been looking at this one, commentary I was sent by the publishers, actually, the New Pillar commentary by Sigurd Grindheim. And one of the things he notes all the way through is the extent to which the patristic writers, the early church fathers, actually quote Hebrews, and they go to Hebrews for their theological engagement in exactly those questions.
Yeah, yeah. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So we'll probably observe that en passant.
Yeah.
So we go through chapter 2.
It was also interesting, though. I mean, you've mentioned the context of chapter 1. In looking at our passage, I think it's really important as well to just trace through the argument in the first verses of chapter 2 as well, because again, you can see the significance, the Jewishness of this, the rootedness in the Old Testament. Therefore, verse 1, we must pay much closer attention to what we've heard, lest we drift away from it. So there's that drifting away thing. That's one of the main observations. People say, why was Hebrews written? Because there's a danger of Jewish believers of Jesus drifting away from faith in Jesus and drifting back into Jewish thought. Hence, all the arguments here are very Jewish. They're within a kind of intra-Jewish discussion about what is the nature of God's revelation to us. And you see this explicitly in verse 2. For since the message declared by angels proved to be reliable, well, that seems to me that's a reference to the tradition that it was angels who revealed the Torah to Moses.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's saying, well, since you trust the Old Testament text, how much more should you trust the message from Jesus?
Yeah.
Which again connects with verse 1. In many and various ways, God has spoken to us in the past, in the Torah.
Yeah.
But in these last days, he's spoken to Jesus. Now, the other thing that I was really struck about here, that this great salvation, verse 3, was declared at first by the Lord. Well, that's interesting. That's Lucan language about Jesus, isn't it? Who describes Jesus as the Lord. And was attested to us by those who heard. So then you've got this eyewitness tradition. While God also bore witness by signs and wonders, it's more Lucan language from Acts, and various miracles. Now, here's the really interesting thing. And by gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. Does that remind you of anything we've talked about recently?
Yes. Well, of course, 1 Corinthians 12, which we looked at just last week.
Last week and the week before, yeah.
And the week before, indeed, yeah. So quite extraordinary, really.
Yeah. And again, points of connection here theologically, even though the register of theological speech is quite different.
Yeah.
And then verse 5 is also fascinating. And again, this shows the sort of implicit assumptions around this text. For it was not to angels that God subjected the world to come.
No.
What? Pardon?
No.
Well, again, you don't get the idea expressed anywhere else in the New Testament, but this is a Jewish idea that the world to come, ha'olam haba, as opposed to this age, ha'olam hazeh, already exists in heaven to be revealed to us. So in much Jewish thought, it's not a temporal future thing, but it's the kingdom. It's the reality of God with God in heaven, and of course that's exactly what you find in Revelation 21. You knew I had to mention Revelation, didn't you?
Yes, you do. Where the New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven from God,
exactly so,
to earth. Yeah,
and that reality of the world that is to come has been brought forward into the present by Jesus' resurrection.
Indeed, yes, so begun at the resurrection. Yeah.
So, but that seems to be quite important context. The whole thing,
definitely.
And then the immediate context for our passage is this again, more quotations from the Old Testament, verse 12, I will tell of your name to my brothers. And the idea from Isaiah that those who believe are children of God.
Yeah.
And does connect with Johannine theology as well in the gospel.
Yeah.
That brings us into our text, verse 14.
Yes. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil.
So the writer, whom we don't know, it's anonymous. There's lots of debates about who it could be, but I think we just don't know. This is interesting, isn't it? This is kind of following this implicit logic of the Old Testament text he's quoted, which is that Jesus is the archetypal human, because he is although what is man that you are mindful of him, the Son of Man, and of course that's sort of generic Son of Man, but then Jesus becomes the Son of Man, so he is the archetypal human being, and therefore if we as human beings in our nature can become children of God, he must by the sort of divine logic must become fully human in order to redeem us.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it's an interesting phrase, flesh and blood,
which is come into English.
It's come into English, and because it's come into English, I suspect that's why the word order is actually reversed in the English translations from what it is in the Greek, because in the Greek it says blood
and flesh.
And of course,
good observation there. Good spot.
Yeah, well, interesting, isn't it? Because blood becomes very important in Hebrews, doesn't it? Later on, chapter 8, I think. So on. So where the blood of Christ
speaks a better word.
Yeah. So
did I just notice, by the way, isn't it interesting that we find it quite easy to pick out these little phrases from elsewhere in Hebrews that are so memorable?
Yeah, yeah. And somebody, interesting, I preached the other day and somebody quoted, I was preaching about the consuming fire.
Yes.
Or the unquenchable fire.
Oh, yes.
Somebody on the way out said, yeah, what about the consuming fire? Our God is a consuming fire, from Hebrews, the end of the letter to the Hebrews.
Yeah.
And of course, that's one of those phrases that you remember. It is very memorable language, because the pictures that are conjured up with the language are very powerful ones, I think.
And that's why some people think that this is actually a transcription of a speech rather than...
Yeah, it's rhetoric, isn't it? It's rhetorical.
It is very rhetorical.
Yeah.
And again, you can see parallel structures all the way through this message as well. But yes, sorry, you were saying that flesh and blood, and then we get through death, he might destroy the one who has the power of death. And there's two really interesting things there, isn't it? The idea that and this again became really significant in theology in the early church, that it is through death that Jesus destroyed death.
Yeah, by going through death for us that he destroys it. He can't. So the likeness of Jesus to us is all the way from natural, as it were, natural birth from a woman, right through to physical death itself. And this is a really important idea, actually, isn't it, in terms of the later Christian debates around what is the nature of Jesus. To what extent does he share the human nature, and what extent is he divine, and how is that played out in him? And here Hebrews is very clear, I think, and this passage has been used to counter some of those.
And I think I want to push back and say, just because this text became important in later debates, it doesn't necessarily mean it was shaped by those debates.
No, absolutely not.
The writer of the Hebrews is countering Docetism, which
is much later.
To be human. But also Apollinarianism. Now, we're getting into sort of obscure corners of early church heresies here.
Yes.
Tell us about Apollinarianism.
Well, I mean, it's the idea that Jesus was sort of human in his body and his spirit, but divine in the mind, and those sorts of things. It's which bit of him is divine and which bit of him is human. Whereas, of course, ultimately the church decided that it was
in the Council of Chalcedon.
It is two substances in one flesh,
unmixed but undivided.
Unmixed but undivided, exactly.
Right. Now, this is getting a little bit sort of obscure and.
It is.
Well, the question is, what's the pastoral impact of that? Because it really does make a difference.
And I think this identification is really important pastorally. I mean, I've had people in the past in my own parish say, well, when you said, well, the whole point of Christianity is to imitate Jesus, they say, well, we can't imitate Jesus because he was so much more than us. He has so much more ability to overcome temptation than we do.
Yes.
And of course, the point here is that he was exactly like us in that sense. And he gives us his, as the final verse will indicate, he gives us that power to overcome temptation in and through himself. And he's able to sympathize with us. So it's definitely a pastoral issue. This otherness versus this identification.
And just a couple of observations. Firstly, about the shape of the passage. I think you're right that actually it begins with this idea. Jesus fully partook of the flesh and blood like us. And then he goes on a little detour of argumentation, the writer, and then lands back, as it were, in verse 18. To summarize and draw that together. For because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. And we'll go back to the argument in the middle here. But again, just noting the rhetorical shaping here, and that actually the lectionary has done the right thing in choosing verses 14 to 18, because this is clearly a unit. And we know that because in 3 verse 1, he says, therefore, holy brothers, drawing on the language of brother again. So this is a kind of a little self-contained argument. And I think the particular way it's expressed in verse 18 is very significant. He himself has suffered when tempted. So it means that the temptations that Jesus experienced wasn't just a kind of pretend.
No.
It was real. Now we can get into debates about, would it be possible for Jesus to sin, which is difficult. But what this verse seems to say to me is that when we experience temptation, even if it's persistent and regular and kind of just seems to be baked into who we are, that we're drawn to particular things, that isn't the same as sin.
No, because Jesus himself was tempted. Well, and particularly in the Gospels, I mean, he's tempted constantly.
Yes.
So we are to understand.
Yeah.
And the particular temptations at the beginning of his ministry are about the false use of power, the short circuiting to glory, and those temptations are with him through his ministry, and yet he resists them relentlessly.
Yeah.
And isn't that just such a wonderful reassurance?
Yeah.
Because, I mean, those of us who are tempted know how relentless temptation can be.
Yeah.
In all whatever our particular issues are.
Yeah. So, just going back to verse 14, the other fascinating thing about this is the identification of death with the one who has the power of death, that is the devil. So, the writer here holds together both the fact of death, but also the real personal force in Satan as the one who has the power of death over us.
Yes, and that's an unusually explicit connection in the New Testament, isn't it? I'm not sure where else one would go for that to be quite so clear, but it is very clear here. Yeah.
Well, two places. One is beginning of 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about Jesus leading in a victory parade. Well, a victory parade in the Roman context is where you vanquish the enemy.
Yeah.
Of course, the other place where that is
Revelation. Yeah.
Revelation chapter 12, where again, actually, it is a Christus Victor understanding of Jesus's atonement.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's those two places we go to. I can't think of many others, but
John 12, where Jesus says, "Now has come the hour of the casting down the prince of power of the air."
Okay, but not identifying the devil's power of death, particularly is what I'm thinking.
But again, we get the pastoral implications of this popping up in verse 15, isn't it? Because he delivered all those who through the fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery.
Yeah. And fear of death, once again, profoundly pastoral, isn't it? We do all sorts of things to evade the fear of death. We have little things that, people say little things that, what's happened when somebody's died, they've gone to a better place, they're out of their misery, they're all these sorts of things, which are basically indications of our fear of it, but we're trying to sort of massage it away, whereas actually the only way to deal with it is to look to Jesus as the...
Yes, essentially, that, again, Grinheim in his commentary here locates this in the context, the Hebrews context of Greek philosophical ideas, and he says, well, there are two major alternatives to the position that the writer here is setting out. One is a Platonic idea, which is that this is a world of corruption and change because the only things that are valuable are things that are unchanging, and therefore we escape from our changeable, corrupting bodies. Therefore, death is a release into something better. And the other view is the Stoic idea, which is that, well, death is inevitable. We just get used to it, and we, live life as best we can, and there's nothing more we can do. And it's interesting; those are two natural reactions, as you say. You do encounter those.
Yeah, we do. Yeah,
in reality,
still stay.
But also the identification of the fear of death with slavery. I think again we're getting this implicit reference to the Exodus.
Yeah.
So again, location and understanding of who Jesus is in the Exodus narrative. And again, that comes out explicitly in Revelation, in Paul as well. In 1 Corinthians 8, he talks about the Exodus in those terms. And then in verse 16, we get another Exodus reference, don't we?
We do. Absolutely. Where this word, usually translated help, does not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. This word help actually means to grasp hold of, and it's used
by the hand.
By the hand, yes, and it's used later on in Hebrews, I think in chapter 8, of God leading the people out of slavery in Egypt to freedom. So God grasps his people and takes them away from slavery. So that's very much the idea that's in the background here.
Fascinating to see the phrase offspring of Abraham as well.
Yeah, descendant, yes, indeed, yeah.
And on the one hand, that's, again, speaking in a Jewish register, because, of course, again, we see this in the debates in the middle of the fourth gospel about who are Abraham's descendants. and that for first century Jews, their identity was their offspring of Abraham. And then, of course, Jesus and then Paul also says, well, actually, being an offspring of Abraham isn't primarily about your ethnicity or your genetics. It's actually about saying, well, actually, Paul, particularly in Romans 4, says, Abraham was justified by faith. Therefore, the ones who are offspring of Abraham are the ones who also share that inheritance of faith. We hear the invitation of God and respond and receive the justification which comes as a gift to them.
Absolutely. And the idea, this idea of help help is a bit of it diminishes it a little bit in our
translation. It's a slightly weak word in English.
It's a weak word, exactly, because it's actually about deliverance. It's about, So,
the help is the help you give a drowning person when you throw them a life ring.
Exactly.
It's not someone where you go and fetch the rice to help someone cook a meal.
No, exactly. Precisely. Yeah.
Therefore, again, there's strong logical connective, although not un, but therefore, he had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest. So here we are, the introduction of the idea of Jesus as high priest, distinctively.
Yes.
But again, Jesus as our brother is coming across incredibly strongly, isn't it?
Yes, because a priest in ancient Israel had to be both. I mean, they had to be identified. I mean, they had to be human.
Yeah.
And of course, they had to have a relationship, as it were, with humanity, but they also had to have a relationship with God. So Jesus here is both merciful, i.e., merciful towards people, and faithful, i.e., faithful towards God. So there's that dual aspect cannot be diminished or taken away without completely losing the point. No. So
but this is distinctive. Again, in the Old Testament, it's not high priests who are described as merciful.
No,
God.
It's God is described as merciful. Yeah.
So Jesus as high priest here in the service of God is affecting the mercy that God wants to give us. Again, another thing that Grinheim points out really interestingly is that in the Greek Old Testament, that merciful is often paired with compassionate, oitimon. And that word compassion is the one that Paul uses in Romans 12 when he says, and again, English translations say, in view of the mercies of God. Actually, it's in view of the compassions of God, which he has rehearsed through that story in the first 11 chapters. Therefore, we respond in this particular way by offering our bodies as a living sacrifice.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we get this word propitiation, hilaskomai, which again is a very Jewish, very technical word for atonement. It's the language from Leviticus of the sacrificial system. A couple of years ago in our midweek home group, we watched the Bible Project video on Leviticus. And it was really helpful in two regards. One is that it showed how important these ideas of sacrifice were for understanding Jesus in the New Testament on the one hand. And on the other hand, it actually makes clear that I guess we kind of stereotypically, we non-Jewish readers of the New Testament who are followers of Jesus, there's a danger we stereotypically say, well, the sacrificial system is all about what we do for God. And therefore, because we do this, then he, is nice to us. But actually, what that video shows is that the sacrificial system is something God offers to us.
Yes.
God offered to Israel.
Yes. It's so given to them. Yeah.
You're sinful. I'm holy. There's a problem here. Let me provide you with a way which resolves that problem, which offers atonement so that you can enter my presence.
Yes. And the point of Hebrews is that Jesus is the logical fulfillment of that provision of God for all time, for all humanity.
And again, we just have to read this language of the high priest in the service of God, present tense. Jesus is alive and is active. And that's the way in which, as it were, he smuggles in the reality that Jesus had to have been raised from the dead because death had not conquered him, and he'd conquered death.
Yes. And this becomes, this phrase here, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people, is really the theme of the rest of Hebrews, isn't it? It's working out what that means and how it how it operates within a Jewish thought, within Judaism as a Jewish thought, and with Greek thought, as it were.
Greek expression of that. So we've got a biblical Old Testament idea articulated and wrapped, as it were, in Greek philosophical language. We've managed to get our way through those 5 verses. have you any reflections on preaching on Hebrews and preaching on this kind of text?
I think I would want to go back to those pastoral questions. It's very possible. I mean, this looks like a profoundly deep and theological piece, doesn't it? And it is. But let us not think that theology is not pastoral. It is profoundly pastoral, as we often articulate in various ways, don't we? And I would go for those pastoral questions, such as, what the fear of death issue is clearly an issue. The issue about Jesus being other is also clearly an issue. And I think one could reinvigorate one's engagement with the person of Jesus and through preaching on this passage, actually. That'd be such a good way to do it.
Yeah. And I think it's also worth remembering that Aristotelian threefold dimension of speaking, which is the three elements of logos, ethos, and pathos. So logos about the content, ethos about our credibility as we speak, and pathos saying there's an emotional response here. And for me, I often find that the ethos question, why is this relevant? Why does it matter? And it served quite well by beginning with the pastoral problems we face, which it so happens this passage is going to address.
Absolutely.
And actually talking about the question of death and talking about the question of, does God actually understand and identify us with? And actually establishing the fact that we together, preacher and congregation, recognize that these are big issues. How can we solve these problems? And creating a sense of felt need. Yes, this is an issue. And then go, we turn to our passage. Well, would you believe it? That addresses those very questions that we've been talking about. It was just a very helpful.
Always a good preaching strategy.
I think it is, James, thank you so much for joining us. Friends, thank you for joining us. James, thank you for joining me. 4 things we love people to do.
Yes, do click like, do subscribe to the channel, do share on your socials, and do comment wherever you see it.
I'll be fascinated to see what comments people have this week. Thank you very much, and see you next time.